Meeting is now being recorded.
And Alice, I'll go ahead and pass it on to you.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. It's nice to have a good crowd here, and happy to have Dr. Perrin. You may have heard him interviewed recently on UNC Radio, talking about his project, Pass the Popcorn, Children's Perception of Obesogenic Culture in Movies. He is an associate professor and the associate chair of sociology here at UNC. And his work is in the area of sociology of culture, things like the links between culture and political behavior, as well as culture and health. And he has a book coming out next month, I think, titled, see if I can pronounce everything, American Democracy from Tocqueville to Town Halls to Twitter. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and please stop calling me Dr. Perrin. There are too many of us around anyway. Just call me Andy. We'll be just fine. It's a pleasure to be here, and the other thing I'll say is please, at any point, just stop and interrupt me. I'm happy to try to say something that matches what you're hoping to hear. And it's nice also, I sit on the Faculty Athletics Committee and the Provost Task Force on Athletics, so it's actually nice to get away from some of the media coverage and conversations that we're having to have elsewhere on campus right now. So thanks for your interest. As Alice said, I'm a cultural sociologist, and I'm particularly interested in thinking about concepts of culture in a broadly theoretical way. And in fact, I should say also I'm the chair-elect of the theory section of the American Sociological Association. So so being part of kind of measurement and empirical investigation is an odd thing for someone like me, and yet a very exciting thing. So what I'm going to talk to you about, this presentation was originally put together for the National Cancer Institute's group on health communication, which funded our Lenore County work, which is what I'll mostly talk to you about. But I will talk to you also kind of more broadly about how we think about culture and what sociology might be able to bring to the table in conceptualizing and measuring culture. So let me first begin by saying that my co-investigators on this project are someone that many of you know very well, Andrew Perrin, my wife, and a very accomplished researcher in pediatrics, and now the new Associate Vice Chancellor for Research here at Carolina. Her colleague, Ashley Skinner, also in pediatrics, and my colleague, Neil Karen, in sociology. And we brought this group together really in order to say, look, if we know stuff about culture and sociology, we know stuff about health outcomes in medicine and public health, what are the best ways that we can bring these two questions or two sort of different sets of strengths and weaknesses together? And so that's the underlying idea of the grant. So we start with really big theoretical questions. I think these are questions that all of you here are interested in and that kind of motivate our approach here. And that is, does culture, whatever we mean by culture, does culture influence health? And if so, how does it do so and to what extent? Right? These are the big questions we want to ask. And in general, to paint with probably too broad of a brush, public health folks tend to be really good at measurement of culture, but the conceptualization tends to be very thin, right? So in public health, when we think about culture, most of the questions have to do with race or ethnicity, maybe region, maybe nativity, but they're fairly thin conceptually questions about culture. Meanwhile, sociologists and anthropologists were really good at talking in big words and big concepts about what culture means. But all too often, the measurement and empirical investigation of culture end up being what one of our luminaries, Paul DiMaggio, has called a virtuoso affair. That is, we're really good at finding culture in small places and documenting it really well, but not terribly good at evaluating its causal effects or the dynamics that it might bring into place. And so the point of this project is to bring to bear, see, I'm behind my slides already. The point of this project is to bring to bear these two sets of strengths and weaknesses together, and that is to find a way to measure health-related, place-based culture in a way that is sociologically robust and, I think, potentially useful in medical and public health research. So let me go back then and tell you a bit about how sociologists, kind of the current state of the art in sociology and thinking about culture, and then circle back around to a place that many of you know very well because of the link between our work and the P50 Center grant in Lenoir County and our implementation of this in that pilot project. The current theory of culture in sociology revolves around the idea that culture essentially provides a toolkit, more recently renamed a repertoire, of what Ann Swidler has called styles, skills, and habits for approaching problems that groups encounter. This was, a big break in 1986 when Swidler pioneered this approach because it fixed a problem that the study of culture had encountered, which is that measured values, which is what people have thought of as culture prior to this, were virtually the same across most cultures, and yet cultural differences in outcomes were quite substantial. And so the question is, how can we explain these differences in cultural outcomes if what we think culture is, that is values, are the same? And what Swidler did was to say, look, what's actually going on is people approach the same sets of values in different ways because of collections of styles, skills, and habits that they have available to them for reasons of cultural patterning. Another way to think about this, this concept of repertoire is that cultures provide shared mental representations, that is, ways in which people understand phenomena similarly because of the cultural environment in which they are set. Or yet another way to think about this same concept is that culture is made up of messages that are out there in the world and the tools that individuals and groups use to interpret those messages within their lives and their social scenes. Because of these things, because of the ways in which toolkits and repertoires are structured, certain kinds of beliefs and behaviors tend to be facilitated. That is, it's easier to interpret a new problem in certain sets of ways. Others may be allowed or disallowed, and certain others may be foreclosed. That is, there are certain kinds of approaches to new problems or new information that you could imagine kind of in a neutral world would be appropriate responses, but are not available because the cultural toolkits, the cultural repertoires that people approach them with don't incorporate those tools, those cultural elements. Some precepts that emerge from this idea are, number one, that culture is collective, not individual, but that cultures tend to overlap and cross-cut, right? So if we think about, in our case, place-based culture, that is Lenoir County having a culture of its own, that's a reasonable and appropriate thing to think. And the way we might operationalize that is to think that people who live in Lenoir County share some set of styles, skills, and habits for approaching problems as they emerge that are more common to people who live in Lenoir County than they would be from a broader random group of people. However, we also think that cultures are multiple and cross-cutting. So race certainly provides styles, skills, and habits, as does ethnicity, gender, social class, family of origin, region of origin, right? These are all different ways in which people gain elements in their cultural repertoires. And so although we think of, on the one hand, culture as collective, not an individual phenomenon, it can end up looking very individual because individual people tend to inhabit lots of different cultural repertoires or cultural toolkits at the same time. So because of this, culture is not just race or ethnicity, although race and ethnicity are cultural phenomena. In my view, the best contemporary synthesis on culture is this rather arcanely titled book published a couple of years ago called Understanding Family Change and Variation Toward a Theory of Conjunctural Action. This book costs a ridiculously large amount of money, but happily is available online through the UNC library. One of the authors is Phil Morgan, the director of the Pop Center here at Carolina, and another of the sort of coordinating authors of the book was Chris Backrack, who spent most of her career as a program officer at NIH, working on how do we measure and think about culture as a predictor of health behavior and health outcomes. And in this book, what they've done is to take and synthesize an enormous amount of theory from sociology and anthropology, essentially, and distill it into a way of thinking systematically about cultural repertoires and how they might impact health behavior. And so that synthesis has really informed the way that we think about culture in this measurement project. And essentially, in this synthesis, we think about culture having sort of two moments at the same time. One of these is what we would call culture in the world. Culture in the world is the physical, technological, textual artifacts that shape human behavior, and over time they tend to refine and change culture in the mind, which is the set of beliefs, styles, skills, habits that people hold in their heads. And the idea of this synthesis is that these two phenomena reinforce one another, even as they are analytically distinct concepts. Culture in the mind tends to explain why groups of people tend to make some decisions and not others, why they tend to think of some opportunities as more attractive than others, and why these decisions tend to be shared in groups. That's why it's social and not an individual phenomenon. So a measurement strategy that takes seriously this synthesis needs to account for culture that's contained in the environment. That's the messages that are out there, the physical environment, and so on, as well as culture contained in the minds of the people within that culture. Right? We need to be able to do both at once. So let me then talk to you a bit about our little piece of the Lenoir County work. And we're very grateful, of course, to HPDP and the P50 project for a lot of assistance with this process, in which we sort of built this study on top of a lot of knowledge about Lenoir County that emerged from that project. So here's the empirical puzzle that we used to launch our study. And essentially, the dots are the standard deviation between states on mean BMI. It's a very geeky, technical kind of thing. But essentially what we find is that there is substantial variation between states in BMI. This variation increases over time, and the increase is particularly strong among women. Our own analysis, which we don't show here in the graph, suggests that this is not mostly about demographic differences. That is, as much as we throw at these differences in standard deviation of BMI, we can't make most of the difference go away. So the question that we then use this to animate is, could local culture in some way explain some of the difference in these regional variations? Recognizing that local culture is not the only culture going on, but it is some of the culture going on.
I'm going to stop you on
Yes,
that.
please.
So this is standard deviation between what now? Give me
No, it's between states, so it's all 50 states.
Okay.
Standard deviation between all 50 states over time, broken out between men and women. So all we're using this to demonstrate is that there remains significant variation state to state in BMI, that this is different between men and women, and in fact most of the increase in variation has been in women over the time period. And what we're not showing in this graph, but in other analysis, we're not able to make that variation go away by throwing more demographic information into the mix. And so we think there's something about, effectively the question is, so there's something about the state in this analysis, and the county in the analysis we'll show next, that is distinct from the collection of individual people that are found in that state. I suspect that's true, but I don't know that.
By clusters of states that might represent cultural regions?
No, we haven't, but we may. We may decide to do that, but we haven't as of yet. And the reason we haven't really is that all we really want to do is use this finding to animate the possibility that that culture as a regional phenomenon, as a group phenomenon, might explain part of that difference. The next slide, many of you probably know a lot better than I do, but I'm going to show it because it's part of the presentation anyway. And this is a discussion of Lenoir County. And you all know this better than I do, but essentially Lenoir County is a rural county of a population of about 60,000. The county seat is Kinston, a population of about 21,000. It's about 56% white, about 40% black. And it's among the poorest counties in North Carolina, and certainly what we might call a stroke belt county. So, as we discussed, cultures are not uniform. However, there's reason to believe that geographical units, such as a county, might be one source of cultural variation. Lenoir also has something interesting about it for our purposes, which it has a relatively high gradient between SES and obesity. That is, being poorer in Lenoir County gives you a greater risk of obesity than the average across counties in North Carolina. I don't want to make that claim too strong. That's not the center of our analysis, but it's an important piece of what we hope ultimately to do comparatively across counties in future work. So again, the question is, can local culture in some way explain some of the variations in health outcomes? Our interest, this is an R03 grant provided to do methodological innovation, and so our interest is really in the development of a strategy for measuring local culture. And so while we're interested in place-based health-related culture, we're not making a claim as of now that the culture we measure actually causes the health outcomes. Right now, this is a proof of concept that we can successfully measure local place-based culture. So here's what we did. The first piece of the project was what we call culture in the world, our attempt to capture culture in the world and the physical instantiation of culture in Lenoir County. We took a random sample of road segments in Lenoir County, and we developed a data collection system which was constituted by a Linux-based computer sitting in a car, 2 cameras mounted on the dashboard of the car, driving that random sample of road segments in Lenoir County. Each camera took a photograph every 3 seconds, and they were geocoded as to the latitude and longitude at which they were taken. And that resulted in a total of 6,535 geocoded photographs of what one would see if one drove all the major roadways of Lenoir County.
Didn't you once refer to it as photo voice on steroids?
You could think about it maybe more as windshield tour on steroids, right? And one of the things we wanted to do was to be very careful to be systematic, and so we're looking for what your Martian might see if a Martian suddenly took a great interest in Lenoir County. So I thought I'd show you a couple of these photographs and then tell you how we've gone about coding them and what some of our conclusions and thoughts are as we are finishing up this analysis. So this is a roadway in Kinston, and what you can find in this picture a couple of interesting points. One is, of course, the foregrounding both of Bojangles and Hardee's, which are the 2 most common brand names. I'll show you our coding sheet in a few minutes. So the 2 most common brand names viewed in Lenoir County. There are also no sidewalks or crosswalks in this photograph, nor usable green space. And let me see, I'm doing this from memory, but I don't see any other salient features of this photograph for our purposes. This was one of our favorites, and it's one of our favorites because if you look closely, you can find both the farmer's market sign and a McDonald's advertisement in the same scene. You can also see. No, you can't. Never mind. Forget that. Yeah. Photographs like this one are actually part of one of the papers we're working on coming out of this project. This is usable green space. We see, well, first of all, we see a crosswalk and sidewalks, and we also see a park. This is one of the municipal swimming pools in Kinston. What we don't see, even though this is a 75-degree sunny weekend afternoon, and this is replicated across the data set, we don't see any people in the green space, in the picnic areas, on the playgrounds, in the parks, on the sidewalks. There are vanishingly few people in the photographs that we took. So one of the kind of interesting puzzles that I think might be amenable to cultural analysis is how do we explain the fact that even when the built environment is good, the use of that built environment is low. That pool was closed.
Open. I've never seen it open.
Is that right?
Yeah. I've looked enough to say, yeah.
So in our focus groups, which I'll tell you about in a moment, they claim to have been there. So therefore that it's and swimming in it. So they claimed that the pool exists and is open. It was certainly closed when we took these photographs, but the park surrounding it obviously was not closed. Yes?
So you said that because it could be good, but in all surrounding it is very shut down. So
Yes, it could.
How are you accounting for that in your?
Well, so we there's two ways to approach that question. One of the ways is to use GIS type data to ask whether there is evidence of unsafeness surrounding a particular area in which we've taken the photographs, and we may go down that road at some point. The other piece, though, is that we have, because of the structure of these data, we have essentially a census of places in Lenoir County. So unless all of Lenoir County is unsafe to go out, that the explanation doesn't explain the finding. Other questions? So let me show you what we're doing. I probably should have shown you the coding sheet beforehand. But we took, as I said, about 6,500 photographs, and we've divided them up electronically and randomly sampled them so that each member of our team was assigned a certain number of photographs to code. And we had 15% of the photographs overlapping so that we can get some inter-rater reliability measures as well between people. It's hard to read on here, so let me tell you a bit about this. Each photograph of, yikes, there we go, thank you. Each photograph is presented to the coder just like this. The photograph provides, the photograph is provided in small picture there. If you click on it in the real coder, you get a full-size picture as well. And then, as you see in the top right, you can also click to get a Google overhead view of the same spot, so you can assess if it's unclear from one angle. We tried to rate the places as to whether they were commercial or industrial, residential, rural or farm, wilderness or forest, or other or unclear. And we tried to rate for each photograph whether there was text or images discernibly present, and whether this text or image had either food or exercise-related messages, either healthy or obesogenic, in those messages. We also recorded whether there were any people present in the photograph, which means people outside cars, those discernible individual people, whether those people were children, and whether they were bicycling, walking, doing yard work, or sports. None of these is mutually exclusive, so we have full information about whether there are people. We rated each space as to whether it had a place to do physical activity and whether this place was private or public, whether there was a sidewalk, a crosswalk, a park, a play structure, graffiti, a restaurant, a grocery store, a religious institution, or a school. And then we made a comprehensive list of brand names that were observed in each photograph. And the way this is a routine I've written for other coding processes in the past, but when we come across a new brand in a photograph, we type it in under the other column, and then it appears in each future coding opportunity. So we have a really strong list of literally every brand name that can be seen, and we can plot those brand names with where they appear spatially and where they appear relative to other pieces of Lenore County. Yes.
We have time, day.
So all of the photographs were taken on the same afternoon. So they were all taken on a Saturday afternoon in March. The temperature was about 80 degrees. It was sunny outside, and it was a weekend. I don't remember the date in particular. Sorry. Okay. So that's the measurement strategy for culture in the world. The next question is, how do we tie this then to culture in mind, to what people are thinking and believing in their heads? And for this, we held a series of 4 focus groups among people who had lived in Lenore County for at least 2 years, although as it turned out, the length of residence was much, much longer than that. We asked them questions about healthy eating and behavior, and we also asked them to respond to a series of questions from the photo study, right? This is the idea that culture in the world and culture in the mind co-constitute one another. So we wanted to essentially take to them photographs that we had taken and ask them to analyze these. We're just finishing now the transcription process of those focus groups, and we'll be analyzing them for themes. I was talking to Tom a little bit before about one of the interesting themes, which is how people interpret sort of the risk of trying new things in the context of poverty, which related specifically to healthy eating and ingredients. So we'll do something with that, and we'll do something as well with how people interpret what constitutes healthiness, both in kind of moral and medical terms. Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Sure. We chose graffiti because we thought it was a relatively low-level marker for sort of neighborhood disorder, and because we thought we would find the coders would get tired of looking carefully for the physical characteristics. We could go back and do more. The photos will be available for anyone to play with if you like. Yes. So so we'll be analyzing these focus groups for essentially how people talk about what amounts to the relationship between economic disadvantage, healthy exercise, and healthy eating opportunities. And we were really lucky to have 2 fantastic graduate students accompany us and take some really remarkably good ethnographic field notes about those focus groups. So I think we'll have some really interesting things to say about kind of how people approach these questions. So here are the papers that we hope to work on, at least in the first round, coming out of this project. One of them is based upon that early graph I showed you about changing obesity risk factors across the states, and this really just animates the cultural analysis that we do later on. The second piece is what I've been calling the unbuilt environment, the idea that culture constitutes an unbuilt environment that works alongside the built environment to potentially change people's exercise behaviors. I want to emphasize that this is not a complete analysis by any means, but approximately 0.08% of photographs in our sample show people at all, not just people exercising, people at all, even though they were taken on about the best day you could possibly take them. And even though we actually find we found a typo on the slide, but we also find approximately 28.4% of those photos actually show physical characteristics that in some way would be amenable to healthy behavior, whether those are parks or play structures, sidewalks, crosswalks, and so on. So we certainly are not arguing that the built environment is irrelevant, but that the built environment doesn't exhaust differences in actual physical behavior. We'll also be working on an analysis of the focus groups with evidence in particular on local culture, poverty, and obesogenic behaviors, and that's what I was talking to you before about how people conceptualized what it means to be healthy in behavioral terms. And then finally, we're working on a methodological article that more or less traces the presentation I've just given, that explains sort of how we can think about culture in a sociologically robust way, but in a usefully measurable way at the same time. And our hope would be ultimately to be able to do this kind of analysis on a comparative level, to be able to say, does, for example, local culture, measurable local culture, explain maybe differences in that SES obesity gradient that we can observe across counties at baseline. See, I got ahead of myself again. So this is a way, we argue, a way of thinking about health-related place-based culture that's systematic enough to allow comparison and causal inference across places, and that we hope to do some strategic comparisons among matched counties, right? And again, the state-by-state work is okay, but what we really hope to be able to do is drill down to smaller localities, county-level localities, and to ask whether observed differences in the risk factors for obesity can, to some extent, be explained by actual measurable culture. All right. Let me stop for a sec there and ask if there are questions about this piece, because the next thing I'm going to do is tell you about a different project, which is also about culture and health, so very related, but it's a break. So let me ask.
Yeah, Andy, like this, and I was concentrating on another part of what the people who participated in the focus. How did you get them, and have some idea of what kind of variation among them there was? And then the second question is just trying to, I know that this is forthcoming in the analysis that you're doing. A couple of examples of what you think the culture of the mind statements or operationalization of that would be like, or, you know, from those just...
Sure. Already forgotten the first question you asked. Sorry. Right. So we recruited the focus group. We recruited the focus groups with great help from Beverly through the P50 staff in Lenore County, who put announcements out in lobbies and so on, and we just waited for people to contact us, and we were able to get lots of contacts.
And sort of diverse age of people?
The age was very diverse. Nope, the age was very diverse. We had, we required people to be 18, and we had several 18-year-olds, and I think our oldest participant was over 70. So we had quite a bit of variation in age, significant variation in race, very little variation in income. I'll just say almost everybody was at the bottom end of even Lenore County's income scale.
And why do you think that was in terms of selection?
I suspect it's because we offered money to participate in the focus groups, but I don't know that for sure.
Might be how you identify this culture of the mind. I mean,
sure.
Statements, or what are the things?
Sure. And I need to apologize ahead of time because we haven't done that process systematically at all yet. But I'll give you a couple of interesting examples. So one example that I was talking to Tom about before is that there was a lot of, I would call it even guilt-organized talk about, I know I should do X, but in fact I don't. Which is interesting because we went out of our way to avoid inducing guilt. So there was a lot of conversation about sort of why I don't do what I believe I should do, and that's one of the things our graduate student noted is that it was almost a moralistic kind of talk about I ought to be this kind of person and I'm not in fact this kind of person. One of my favorite examples, because it's sort of interestingly complex, is a woman who spoke for a long time about how much she loved watching the Food Network and learning complicated recipes, and so not one of us, one of the other members of the group said, well, you know, what have you cooked from the Food Network? And she says, oh, I don't cook anything from the Food Network, and the reason is that I'm worried I'm going to burn it. I'm worried it's going to be not successful when I try to make it. And the concern, she said, if I buy a chicken and I'm not going to be as eloquent as she was, but if I buy a chicken and then I try to cook it in a new or special way and I ruin it, that's my meat for the week, and I can't, I can't buy something else. And so so we're thinking about this in terms of both the moralistic conversation about what kind of person you should be, the interpretation of what constitutes healthiness, because Food Network in her mind certainly was the way to interpret things as healthy, and the interpretation of poverty and risk with respect to cooking. So that's one example.
How about a small question, then
Please.
I'll stop here. This is just so interesting. But the other thing that I've thought a lot about, and not a lot about, but I've thought a lot about in terms of culture is the engagement of individuals with popular culture and with sort of bringing popular culture as a standard into their world and seeing that as their worldview of what ought to be.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking about the culture of TV and media, thinking about Food Network means cable and dish and all those things, which allows the world to come in to people's lives when they don't have the ability to get to those places otherwise.
Right, absolutely. So one of the other, I suspect, just from having been at the focus groups, I suspect we'll do a lot with exposure to media and implicit comparisons with media.
Very interesting.
Yes, I agree. And it's also a nice segue because the next stuff that we're talking to you about is a different project about media.
I was thinking maybe for a particular kind of journal there would be maybe some qualification of what you're finding visually, what may be in some of our data, our enrollment data, because indeed it screams out no one walk.
Yeah.
You know, the questions about physical activity, because we looked at that and spent a lot of time going, wow, no one walk. You know, and also, and I'm going to kick myself again, because we have these individual coaching.
Right.
They're recorded more for us to do kind of QA on the coaching sessions, not for data, but they're screaming the same stuff that you're mentioning from individual patient voice now. Focus group now. And example after example of the types of activities they do in there as well. We've only listened to a few of them because truly this is a key. At some point, we've talked about this, at least Kathy and I and Beverly. We didn't consent for it. You know, but if you're getting to that, I don't know this field at all, but if you're getting to the point where someone's like, well, can't you validate this against at least some of your other measures that you do locally before you do the county by county kind of work, I think there's an opportunity to look at some of our...
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's another question. How are you conceptualizing norms?
So we don't conceptualize norms at all. And in part the reason why we don't is that previous work in cultural sociology has suggested it's really difficult to measure norms because people report one thing as what they think is correct or what they think is appropriate, and then they seem to do things that are very different from those. And actually, Ann Swidler's book that developed the concept of repertoire demonstrates this really well for romantic love, that people have one set of scripts that they use for describing what they believe ought to be the case for romantic love, and it's completely mismatched from their actual behaviors and decisions. So we don't is a basic answer because we don't think norms probably exist and they're probably latent out there, but they're they're probably findable only by watching what people do as opposed to what they articulate. Sure. One of my former grad students, who's a professor at Duke now, Steve Basie, has done this really neat work on fixed choice versus open-ended questions about morality, totally separate from health at all. And what he's found is that fixed choice questions do a better job of predicting actual moral behavior than open-ended descriptions of moral standards. His description is that, as it turns out, it's easier to recognize. He makes the comparison between a police lineup, and a sketch artist. It's much easier to recognize your moral worldview when someone reads it to you than to have to describe that moral worldview from whole cloth. Yeah, I'd love to talk more. Yeah. Yeah.
Lenore County and
Yeah.
the culture and the mind of the individual. Smaller context between, Lenore.
Yep.
Somewhere in between there, I would imagine.
So I would say two things. One is absolutely we would assume that culture operates at lots of different levels at once, and that the people in the business school talk about workplace culture. People elsewhere in sociology talk about, as you say, family cultures. There's reasonably good evidence that there actually is a United States culture that is measurably different in interesting ways from, say, French or South African culture. And so we would assume that it operates at all those levels at the same time. And that we've, in a sense, arbitrarily picked one level, which is the level of the county. And that is really just an arbitrary decision based on what we can measure and what we think is of substantive interest. I would still say that at each of those levels, we would assume there to be a co-constitution between culture in the world, meaning all those physical objects and messages and stuff that are out there, and culture in the minds of whoever the people are that are involved in that particular collectivity. Does that make sense?
I'm just wondering, I'm sort of thinking about it in contrast.
Right.
Yeah, the two counties are very different. And relative to the whole city versus Nash, and they're pretty racially segregated.
Right.
I would imagine that smaller culture kind of makes
Absolutely.
the culture of Rocky Mountain. So I'm
Yes.
just trying to think about that.
And in fact, so if we think about a culture in the world kind of rubric, what I would probably say is that, based on your description of Rocky Mount, that the existence of this physical bifurcation is probably a piece of the way in which the regional culture works, right? So physical manifestations are objects around which culture forms. Why isn't there what, sorry?
A culture of one.
Why isn't there a culture of one person? There isn't a culture of one person because culture is essentially defined to be shared. Could you imagine, I don't know,
Well, I just
you could find
like
such a
a
thing.
person who lives by themselves,
Right.
for example,
Yeah.
creates the world that, while they have a mind and they have a physical world
Right.
that might infer their house, you could characterize it different than a single person living in the next.
Yeah.
And also it changing all the time.
Mhm.
So I was just wondering where in sociology
Yeah.
that distinction between
Right.
thinking
I mean, the hermit plays a special role in sociology as kind of the figure against which the discipline is organized.
Okay, you answered the question. No, I got it. Yeah, no, it's,
you know, but in truth, there really aren't very many hermits in the world, and when they do exist, they are the active decision of individuals to reject culture, and so the best way of thinking about it is that it's an anomaly that sort of proves the rule.
the hermit with 1,000 cable channels.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it makes me think of the notion of somebody's MO, you know, or their personality, and you're moving it through, which is
right.
kind of how you...
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure, you know, but then I guess psychology owns that, but then, you know, there's a...
Yes.
So with the picture-taking stuff, you talked a fair amount about the physical. Other than the signs for fast food, what other kind of food-type things?
We saw remarkably little other food-type things. We certainly, you know, we found restaurants and we found grocery stores and so on. And we also, by the way, there's one, forgetting the name of it, but there's one grocery store that elicited very strong opinions, both positive and negative, in our focus groups when we showed pictures of it. No, it's the one that's in the middle of downtown.
Oh, the health food one, is that right?
No. Gosh, I won't remember. I feel like it starts with an H, but I can't remember.
But were
Not much.
But the extremes were like that it's really...
In truth, the extremes were there's no good food observable from the street. Right. So one objection would be that conversations or access to good food is inside stores or inside families. But again, from the Martian's eye view, there's nothing other than a total saturation with fast food and grocery store specials on bad stuff.
But the focus group, didn't you say they reacted strongly one way or the other to
Yes.
the grocery store?
Yes.
So on what context?
In terms of its relative quality of the food compared to its price.
Okay.
Yeah. Whether they trusted it.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Your methodology.
Right. So a couple things to say. One, no, we didn't code for gardens. Although in this other project, through the P50, we do have some information about gardens. We didn't just take pictures at intersections. We took pictures every 3 seconds down every roadway, so every roadway of any significance in Lenore County. So we would capture, we would capture that. We don't walk. We don't go outside.
You can't use it working in a field or garden.
Nope. Now, it was a weekend, so insofar as it's sort of paid hourly work, you could imagine perhaps that there might have been more during the week.
Go to your next.
Okay, move on. Great. So let me tell you about this very different study which we're working on now. And this is a very broad, multidisciplinary study, which is called Pass the Popcorn, Children's Perceptions of Obesogenic Culture in Movies. And again is in collaboration with Eliana, as well as an incredibly wide group of scholars across campus from quantitative psychology, journalism, mass communication, art history, health policy, clinical psychology, pediatrics, and psychiatry. What we're trying to do here is, again, in a different vein, but we're using the same conceptual framework about culture in the world and culture in mind. We want to look at the ways in which children view and interpret messages both about healthy eating, healthy and unhealthy eating, healthy and unhealthy physical activity, and stigma about body size, all at the same time in movies. And the preliminary study that gave rise to this project is forthcoming in the journal Obesity, and we coded 20 movies that were the 4 top grossing G or PG movies each year between 2006 and 2010. We looked for a whole bunch of, we divided them into 10-minute coding segments and coded each segment separately, and looked for 35 observable behaviors related to food, physical activity, and stigma. Most of them patterned after the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, but some of them just patterned after what we thought would be of substantive interest. Most of the movies portrayed sugar-sweetened beverages, exaggerated portion sizes, although we have an amusing inter-rater agreement problem with evaluating when a portion size is exaggerated.
Local culture.
Yes, local culture indeed. And 75% of movies showed unhealthy snacks. Branded foods and fast food were less prevalent. Physical activity was very common, but so was sedentary activity with TV, computers, and video games. The most interesting thing that we found, and that we want to follow up on in this next study, is that stigma about body size is incredibly pronounced across these movies. 70% of movies and fully 23% of movie segments contain stigma about being being overweight. Another 20% of movies contained it about being underweight. So for a total of 80% of the movies and a full quarter of segments contained weight-related stigma of some kind, and 94% of that was related to stigma about overweight as opposed to underweight. At the same time, when we coded just what we called our Gestalt understanding, which actually had really high inter-rater reliability for what we considered unhealthy versus healthy scenes in the movies. Fully a third of segments were coded as unhealthy. There was at least one neutral scene in every movie, at least one unhealthy scene in 95% of the movies, which means you can do the math, all but one. But there was at least one healthy scene in 90% of the movies. So what does this mean from our pilot study? One is that obesogenic content is widely present and commonly reoccurred. More scenes are unhealthy than are healthy. But at least as concerning is the prevalence of stigmatizing content, both stigma toward overweight characters themselves and stigma toward the possibility of becoming overweight in characters who are mostly characters who are eating a lot of food. The prevalence of these behaviors can influence children in interestingly and important harmful ways. Children, of course, are usually discouraged from bullying, judging, and teasing. However, these movies contain messages encouraging that behavior across the board, and they provide this really problematic catch-22 in which children are exposed to messages valorizing sedentary behavior and poor eating habits, but also warning them that if they engage in these things and become obese, they will be subject to stigma, in fact, in some cases, violence, physical violence directly related to body size. So students, I shouldn't say students, children are getting discordant messages from these, depicting on the one hand unhealthy choices as the norm, but mocking the effects of these. We know that there is ways in which the content of television movies has influenced children in other health domains such as tobacco use and violence, sexual initiation. So there's reason to think that kids are paying attention to these messages and may make decisions based on them. What we don't know from the research in this pilot study is how children actually interpret these messages. And so the idea for this new project, new grant, actually came as our younger son Daniel went to a birthday party and watched a movie, and he came home and he said, Mama and Dada, this movie would have been great for your project because it had lots of obesogenic behavior and lots of stigma. And we can't remember. We really wish we could remember what the movie was that sent him off to tell us this. But the idea that we could actually teach kids to recognize these messages and interpret them in different ways suggested to us that this is really right for a strong cultural analysis in which we try to figure out what culture is going on in kids' minds and how they use that to interpret culture in the world, in this case, visual culture in the movies. And so that was the impetus for this project. This project is funded by an R24 grant from a really cool interagency funding opportunity through OpNet, which is the social sciences research arm of National Institutes of Health. And the idea is to develop measurement tools to understand basic processes behind movies and other cultural factors' effects on attitudes and behaviors related to obesity. So we're in the process now of building this transdisciplinary research team. I showed you our list of scholars, and we have these fascinating team meetings in which we're building the models. And you know, our art historian is telling us about how we interpret visual culture in films and the experience creation of the audience, essentially. And then we're talking also about you know, energy imbalance and very scientifically technical terms at the same time. It's a really tremendous opportunity to do this. And what we want to do eventually is actually develop measurement strategies to determine how cues affect attitudes and intentions with regard to eating activity and weight status. We are working in collaboration with the Varsity Theater to essentially have kids, if you've seen the CNN decision analyzer that they do during debates where people can say, I like what they're saying. So we're going to use a version of that. Sit kids in the Varsity Theater and watch as they learn to interpret movies that are of substantive theoretical interest. So that's the ultimate empirical project that will come out of this here.
Are there studies about product placement?
Yes.
What do they show?
Yes. Oh gosh. I don't know.
Joe Camel, yes, it works.
Yes. Yes. So product placement is very common. It's more common in television than in movies, although it's increasingly common in movies. And it appears, this is just a guess more than anything else, but it's branded food is less common in movies than other kinds of branding.
They're, you know, what your son's coming in
Yep.
their toolbox and how they're interpreting stuff because they're actually going through metamorphosis
Yeah.
for my eyes. So
They should stop that, don't you think?
Exhausted, so I thought I got the toolbox thing figured out, like what toolbox
Yeah.
is going to come in my family, my culture, and then I just got completely exhausted
Yeah.
by 365
Totally.
you know, things. So here, children are being defined as what? Who is going to the varsity theater? What age group?
Gosh, younger than yours and my adolescence.
Okay, cool.
I don't remember what we said, but I think we maybe said 8 to 10.
Yeah, seems like that
Yeah.
metamorphosis
Yeah.
would be a place to go.
So we're interested in G and PG rated movies, and
Yeah.
you know, I remember your adolescent. My adolescent won't see such a thing. So.
That I think of the movies you showed, I don't think it was a Disney movie. It maybe just
Is that
happened
right?
to be that year. And then WALL-E was one which has a lot of obesity.
Yep.
I mean, the whole topic about people
Yes.
being too large to.
WALL-E was in our list of movies,
Yeah.
and it's yes.
So that's really, but it just happened to be the top grossing movie
Yep.
through the year.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Not a Disney movie.
Technically, Pixar is Disney.
I guess WALL-E is, yeah, but I'm constantly saying, I don't know, there wasn't a princess movie. I have two
Ah,
little girls,
gotcha.
so it was not a princess movie that I have seen. And I'd be interested to see if a princess movie
Yeah.
was included, how it would take.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there a culture of stigma, like in other Western countries?
Is stigma greater in the U.S. than elsewhere?
I guess that's an interpretation.
I don't know how to evaluate that question. I think that stigma is an important piece of the humor that's used in kids' movies. I would narrow the question to that point.
That's where I was going to go.
Yeah.
Who's producing these movies and how much in our country are they incorporating?
Right.
Start with like the 22-year-old.
Uh-huh.
There's Glenn Close and has got great comments about why there's no 52-year-old
Yeah.
movies anymore, right? Because of what
what we're letting them show us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, just a piece of this, so y'all probably heard it on about I don't know what app or it was a thing on the mass media where you could do plastic surgery on the girl's face.
On Barbie's doll.
Yeah, Barbie doll.
Really?
Yeah, and it was to make her prettier.
I didn't hear that one.
Take a knife and everything. Like,
Oh my gosh.
Shoulder and arm.
Yeah.
That paradox.
Of a larger size.
Yeah.
So the level of
You would think, right?
stigma is
It's not changed, right? Stunker had done the original study, and I guess
Right.
several years ago now has followed up with the recent study.
The Getting Worse article, yeah.
so we still make fun of Steiny. Or not
Well-
Steiny, I guess it's Tiny, whoever Little Rats
So-
remember.
Yeah, and that if it's the article I remember that you're talking about, it's not even just stigma. It's actually kids nominating who they'd be friends with based on drawings, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
It just
Yeah.
seems odd that where
yeah.
a phenotype is more.
Just talking about something related to that at actually yesterday's meeting of this team, an interesting finding that our clinical psychologist brought up, which was that when you teach adolescent girls that body parts are photoshopped in magazines, it turns out that their self-esteem with respect to those body parts doesn't go up, even though they know that they're photoshopped, and to some extent it goes down. And the cognitive theory as to what's going on is that it encourages the girls to pay extra attention to, like, oh well, if those are photoshopped, that must be what I'm supposed to have, even more so, right? So I don't know if some element of that is a mechanism that might explain what you're saying.
Photoshop.
I'm interested in the impact of stigma on behavior, like with smoking. We often think that those changing social norms had a big influence
Right.
on decrease, but with obesity.
So, there's a big debate going on about the role of stigma. My understanding is there's some evidence that in the case of obesity, stigma makes it worse, that people who feel stigmatized are more likely to become more obese. The one important difference between stigma about obesity and stigma about smoking is that smoking is a behavior, and obesity is a body habitus, right? So, so you could argue, if you wanted to make the parallel would be between overeating or under-exercising, stigmatizing those behaviors, not the bodily habitus.
This is all new content for me. I gotta go. I gotta survive the rest of my day.
I think we've reached beyond the end of our time, but thank you.
Thank you.
I can come back for round 2 here.
Sure.
Okay.
Anytime.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for your interest. I appreciate it.
Thank you.